All right, everybody. So glad to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Yay. All right, cool. I'm going to start with a really quick disclaimer and just I want to point this out. My goal with this short keynote, it's going to be a little bit shorter, um, is to share some ideas on empowering students with voice and choice. But I want you to hear what I'm talking about as an affirmation for what you're doing. So this is not necessarily a challenge to go change your practice or do everything all different, because the reality is teachers have been amazing this year. They have proven over and over again that social distance has not meant relational distance. And with education, we are all under construction. We're all on a journey, and that it is always an experiment. And sometimes that experiment has mistakes and things that go wrong. And we just kind of saw that. And that's a normal part of this learning process. But because teachers make such a difference, I want to share a story of one teacher who made a difference in my life and who gave me that opportunity to have voice and choice in my learning. And in particular, one sentence that changed my world forever. So, a little bit about me: I was born in the Ice Age. It's where I learned how to stop and collaborate and listen. It's where I learned that if there's a problem, I can solve it. And it was at a time when this bad boy was considered cutting edge. And the biggest technology concern I had was not getting dysentery on the Oregon Trail. This was me in the eighth grade. I was incredibly shy and incredibly nerdy. I kind of still am. I had one friend, we'll call him Matt since that's his name. And every day at lunchtime, we would hang out and we would geek out on data, whether it was data from Star Trek or arguing about data in baseball and looking at baseball cards or whatever it was. We were two nerds in a pod and we would hang out. And my whole goal in middle school was to be invisible. If we think about the TV shows of the 1980s, the nerds were the tropes to be tolerated, not the characters to be loved. And so I knew that if I was invisible, I could do my time in middle school and I would be fine. And my plan was working really well. In sixth grade, Matt and I would hang out at lunch and before school, and everything worked perfectly. In fact, Matt never missed a day of school. Every single year, he would get that congratulations on your immune system certificate, perfect attendance, whatever that award is called. Seventh grade, the same thing happens. My plan is working well. But in eighth grade, it was like maybe the first or second week of school. It doesn't occur to me that this could happen, but Matt actually gets sick. Nothing severe, just the cold. And so there's a moment in that when I'm um, standing there in the cafeteria and I look out where Matt and I always hang out, and he's not there. I look out at the sea of students all around, and I just hope that somebody will invite me to their table, but it doesn't happen. And so I wait. I start doing the dude head nod, right? I keep hoping someone will call me over to their table. And I wait and I wait and I wait, frozen in the cafeteria, just standing there holding my tray. Finally, I throw my food away and I go to the restroom and I hide out for those 22 painfully long minutes to go by. Eventually, the bell rings. I wipe my eyes and I head over to class. Now, my goal had been to be invisible. I wanted to be invisible, and I was invisible. But I was not invisible to Mrs. Smoot or to Mr. Darrow. See, they knew me. They knew that I loved baseball. They knew that I had a heart for social justice. They knew that I loved history. So they invited me to be a part of the National History Day project. Now, this was the first time I had ever owned the learning. And I would love to say that it was enjoyable or it was fun or it was, and those things are true, but it was also incredibly hard and incredibly scary. See, here's what happened. They called me over to the side of the classroom and they said, John, we want you to be a part of this National History Day competition. And I said, no way. There is no way that I'm going to present at a competition. And they said, no, 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 no. You don't have to be part of the competition. You just have to present to your peers. Now, this was already starting to sound a little bit scary. But then they said, look, every Friday, you get to work on this. And you don't have to work on your social studies or language arts. You can work on this project. And there's no homework for the entire school year. And I was sold. And so I said yes. And then they gave me a warning that turned out to be right. They said, John, you are going to work harder on this project than you've ever worked on anything at school before. And they were absolutely right. The truth is, I was really good at playing the game of school. I knew how to get A's in classes that I liked, B's in classes that I didn't care about as much. I knew how to keep my parents happy. And suddenly, I couldn't play the game anymore because the rules had changed. And I was the one that got to rewrite those rules. There were moments where it was absolutely exciting. And then there were moments where I was terrified. I remember coming up with a list of like topics and going up to Mr. Darrow and saying, which one should I choose? And he said, which one is the most interesting to you? And then I went to Mrs. Smoot and I said, Mr. Darrow's not helping me. Tell me, which topic should I choose? And she said, which topic will sustain your interest for a full year? And I realized I was going to have to do this myself, and it was scary. So I chose the integration of baseball, the story of Jackie Robinson, and I began to research, came up with all these questions on my own. It was the first time I got to answer my own questions in school. And I went to them and I said, which way do you want me to organize my research? Binders, note cards, different teachers have different ways. You tell me. And they said, well, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. How do you think you should organize it? What strategy works best for you? And I said, well, I kind of want to do it in a spreadsheet. Could I use a spreadsheet? And they said, absolutely. Do your research in a spreadsheet. So I did. And so I got really into this project. I started navigating the dark art of microfilm and microfiche. I don't know if anyone remembers that back in the day. I started looking up any article I could find. And then I realized that I couldn't find every single answer in a text. I would have to do something really scary, talk to people. So I reached out to the head of the Negro League Museum, Buck O'Neill, and he connected me with all these former baseball players. And I began to do interviews. And every single time I would be so nervous, I would just want to quit the whole project. And then I would do the interviews. And afterwards, I would be so glad because I was gaining a new perspective on history. I remember one moment where I hit writer's block. I was working on my script for my presentation. And I said, you know what, Mrs. Smoot, I don't feel like writing today. And she said, the nice thing about writing is you can do it if you feel like it or not. You're going to work on this because I'm not going to have you choosing fear over creativity. Well, I got to a point where my project was almost done. I had made all these slides, I made my script, I'd done the bibliography, the written portion, all of it. It was almost finished. And all I had to do was record my script. Now, we got to go to a radio studio, which was incredibly exciting. And the night before, I was thinking about all the, what is it going to look like? How's it going to go? And all that kind of stuff. And then it was actually time to go. And we went to this radio studio. I got to record my voice in this sweet, tricked out place. And then I heard my voice played back to me. I could hear how nervous I sounded. I could hear my braces and the way it was messing with pronunciation. I could hear every single mistake I had made. And I realized this sounded awful. There was no way I was going to do this. So I looked at Mrs. Smoot and I said, I am not going to be a part of this competition. I quit. I'm done. And she said, "Nope, you don't quit. That's not how it works." She said, "John, when you hide your voice, you rob the world of your creativity, and I'm not going to let you do that. You can re-record, practice, you can keep going, but you have to present." We made a deal. And so I continued to record and edit, and it was like this reel-to-reel tape with Scotch tape and razor blade where you cut it. A couple weeks later, it was time to present. Now, that morning, all I could think about was every single mistake that could happen. What if kids laugh? What if I'm nervous? What if it doesn't work? What if on this cycle? What if, what if? Hang out at lunch with my friend Matt. We come back and the room is dark. The projector's all set up. Students begin to stream in, and I'm standing there at the front. Mrs. Smoot announces me, and now it's time to go. I put the cassette in the boom box. I put my hand on the clicker, but it's shaking so bad that when I press play, I click backwards instead of forwards. Now it's going back. And I try to go forward, but it goes back again and then forward. And now awkward silence, whispering, a few snickers here and there. Everything that I was afraid of is happening right here in this moment. And although it feels like it's taking an eternity, it's only about 10, 15 seconds before I find my spot. My pulse is pounding, click. Heart is hammering, click. Muscle memory clicks in, click. I've got this. I barely breathe through those 5 minutes of the presentation. And to my surprise, when it's done, the students actually stand up and they cheer for me. They give me a standing ovation. And I realized that although I had made a huge mistake in the beginning, that's not what they remembered. And I realized that Mrs. Smoot was right. This deserved an audience, but it was too late for me to join the competition. So nervously, I walked up to Mrs. Smoot and I said, "Is there any way I could join the competition? I know it's too late, but maybe if someone drops out, I could take their place. Like, could I do that?" And she just smiled and she said, "John, your mom filled out the paperwork about 3 weeks ago. You're good to go. You're going to practice that presentation, get your nerves out, and you're going to compete." Now, I got to compete at the district competition. I won that. I got to go to the state competition, and then I got to go to the national competition in Washington, D.C. The reality is that experience changed my world forever. Mrs. Smoot was why I became a teacher. That experience was why I fell in love with social studies. It was the first time I had ever owned the learning, and it changed my world. Now, the reality, though, is she was my hero. She still is. And she's why I became a teacher. And yet, when I started out as a teacher, I was a tour guide teacher. I would deliver content to students. If you think about it, the language we use around education and teaching, it would be like, did the students get it? Or I would be assessed on my lesson delivery when I was student teaching. I was the tour guide teacher. I chose where we went. I handled the resources. I did all the assessment. I documented all the learning. I did all of it. And the reason why is I was afraid to give my students voice and choice. I was terrified. Every part of it was scary. What if my principal will judge me? What if they fail the test? What if I don't hit every standard? What if it takes too much time? What if it's too much of a gamble? What if they don't like it? What if? And then there was a moment where I looked at this uncertainty and I realized that I had a hidden opportunity. It was a documentary project. See, what happened is during testing week, state testing week, which was really 2 weeks of testing, I would test kids for about 2 to 3 hours a day, and then I had to entertain them for the rest of the time. I couldn't teach any new content. On top of that, because I was the new guy, they tricked me into taking the challenging kids. They said, John, you're really good at classroom management. So, because this is a strength of yours, we want to give you some of the students who are a little more high energy, which is code word for they don't behave well during the test. And so I had this group of students, and I knew that I had an opportunity to do something different with them. And although they were labeled as challenging kids or loud kids or energetic kids or whatever, they loved this project. I made so many mistakes. It was too structured in moments, it was too unstructured in moments. They were confused in moments, they got frustrated in moments, and yet it was real, it was authentic, it was different. I'd been so consumed with this question, what if it fails, that I never asked the question, yeah, but what if it works? We think about this flow chart right here. Am I sure this will work? If the answer is yes, you get the status quo, and there is nothing wrong with the status quo. We want best practices. But sometimes if we step into that unknown, that's when we get innovation. And the sweet spot is that overlap between best practices and next practices. And so that project became the beginning of something totally different. We had an amazing librarian who actually taught my students how to do media literacy and information literacy. And to my surprise, they met with her, they checked out cameras, and they actually did interviews out in the community that they brought in to be part of the documentary. And although our launch wasn't anything special, we just ran the documentary through the CCTV of the school, right? The whatever that's called, all of the TVs. The entire school watched their documentary. And I watched how proud my students were about the work that they had done. And it became the beginning of a journey. We called it Social Voice, our voice to our world. Documentary projects, STEM projects, service projects, visual art projects, design thinking projects. It was the beginning of something different. And I started asking myself this question, what are we doing for students that they could be doing for themselves? If we think about it this way, our world is changing. My daughter asked this question, Dad, were you alive back when people had flip phones? My kids will never know the struggle of having your finger on that record button, waiting hours to make that epic mixtape, right? That Pearl Jam, that Nirvana. Just kidding. For me, it was totally like Boys to Men and Reba McEntire. But they will never know the struggle of making that mixtape. Now they just say, Alexa, play my favorite song. Siri, play my favorite song. We didn't have Siri. We had Clippy. And Clippy was this paper clip that would try to tell you that you were writing a business letter incorrectly, right? Things have changed. We have this amazing connective and creative power at the palm of our hands. We have automation and AI and all of these things that make it different. And yet the reality is the changes are bigger than that. We were taught as kids to work hard, graduate from college, and climb the corporate ladder. Now, I want to recognize that this formula wasn't true for all students, but it was the formula that we were taught. If you were a minority, if you were a woman, you didn't have the same access. But this was what got my dad out of poverty. He worked hard at school, he got a scholarship, and he worked the same job for 35 years. And yet, the ladder is now a maze. When he retired, half the jobs in his company no longer existed. They weren't hiring people to do shorthand, for example. And there were all these new jobs around artificial intelligence and data analysis that he could never have even imagined when he began. So if we think about the skills that students will need to navigate that maze, they'll need to be empowered in their learning. They're going to need things like empathy, project management, creativity. They're going to need to appreciate new perspectives, engage in inquiry, communicate, research, critical thinking, adaptability, that growth mindset, the perseverance, all of these things which come from students being empowered in their learning. I changed as a person because of that project. They're going to need to be self-directed, to be self-starters and self-management. And what that means is a shift from just engaging students to a place of empowerment. Compliance is doing something because you have to do it. Engagement is doing something because you want to do it, because you find it interesting. But empowerment is doing something out of a place of ownership. So what does this look like? Well, there's 7 different ways that we can empower students. And I'm going to go through this really quickly because of time. So number 1, empower students to choose the topics. So if we look at this continuum of student choice with the topics, we have embedded choice menus where you give them 2 or 3 different options in what they're learning about. We have simple choice menus, which is something like this, where they might do a book review as a podcast, video, blog post, or study guide. We have something even more student-centered where it's an advanced choice menu where they're not only choosing, how they're going to present their information, but they're actually selecting the learning targets, the resources, and the product. And then we have a deeper level of student choice in the topic where they do an independent project. And that can be something like Genius Hour. If you think about that History Day project that I got a chance to do, it was Genius Hour before Genius Hour. Now, if you're not familiar with Genius Hour or 20% time, it comes from Google, actually originally came from 3M, where they give employees 20% of their time to work on an independent project, which is what I got to do with that History Day project. For me, my favorite example of this was Geek Out blogs when I taught middle school. And as you can see here, we have one student doing biology, another student doing the topic of video games, and yet they're all covering the same standards. These driving standards about argumentation, research standards, there's writing process standards that we're covering, publishing standards. And so they're still all learning the same standards, but they're getting a chance to do it in a way where they're getting to choose the topics. Second big idea is to empower students to own the process of their learning. So not just choosing the topics, but choosing the process. And this is the idea of letting students choose the scaffolds that they're going to use, giving them a curation of resources that they can find, letting them choose the strategy. So in math, they might choose to solve a linear equation by looking at a graph, by creating a table, by using the algorithm, and you're giving them a choice in their strategies. If they're doing research, they could do note cards, they could do put it together in a binder. They could do sketch notes, giving them choices in the strategies that they're going to choose in terms of their learning. When it comes to note taking, some students are going to do Cornell notes, some students are going to do sketch notes, and they're getting a chance to choose that. And what that's doing is it's saying, I value your voice. I'm giving you a choice in your learning. You're going to have some agency here. The third big idea is to empower students to ask the questions. It's the notion that students should question answers as often as they answer questions. I love this example of Michelle Baldwin's class where I was blown away with the questions that they asked, and I asked her, what are you doing to develop such great, inquiry in your classroom? And she said, John, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask a question. My goal is to get them to be unafraid. And if I think about it this way, in school, we tend to place a really high value in getting the right answer and getting it quickly. But this is all about saying, I will be humble and admit that I don't know the answer. I will be humble and grow and learn. Now, what does this mean and what does it look like? It means you might need to provide students with some support, like these sentence stems. A larger inquiry project like this Wonder Day project, where students ask questions, they engage in their own research, they analyze data, they share insights, and that leads to more inquiry, right? So if you're a history teacher, you're teaching about, say, the Civil War, you might have a Wonder Day project where one student asks a question about, were there any women who fought in the Civil War? And the answer is surprisingly, yes, a lot of women dressed as men. And door. It's a fascinating thing. Someone else is really interested in artillery and they're going to ask questions about artillery. Very different questions, all still aligned to the topic of the Civil War, but they're getting to ask questions, engage in research, and then they share their findings in a blog post, in a podcast, whatever it may be. I love this example from Dan Meyer where students ask their own questions in math and then they solve those. So he gives them a video, a picture, and he says, what can you do with this? And then they ask the questions in math. The fourth idea is to empower students to own the assessment process. This is something where uh, they're gaining information as they analyze their own work. What they're doing is they're developing better metacognition, and they're also learning that mistakes are okay, that every mistake is another iteration closer to success. It's this idea that failure is permanent, but failing is temporary, and it's a normal part of the process. Now, this doesn't mean that we embrace failure. If we embrace failure, there's a term for that. It's called the Detroit Lions. What we want is students to embrace failing as a part of the learning process and to fail forward and to grow. Now, there's a lot of ways we can do this. They can track goals, do self-reflections, surveys. You can give them rubrics and let them self-assess on the rubric. They can do checklists. It might be, visual self-reflections. It could be polls that you give them. It could be a performance assessment where they record it and then they put it on something like Flipgrid and self-assess that way. It could be self-grading where they actually just grade their work and see what they got right, what they got wrong. It could be something like a concept map where they're showing their thinking a lot around the concepts and how they're related to each other. It could be something summative like portfolios that they develop and that they carry on from year to year. But the goal is that they're owning this process and they're figuring out what they know, what they don't know, and what they're going to do next to hit that level of mastery. It can also be peer assessment with things like structured feedback, a feedback carousel activity, peer coaching. So those are the big ideas there about having students own that process. The fifth idea is to empower students to solve problems. When I was a kid, someone realized that haircuts were messy, and we ended up with the Flowbee, which was a combination of a hair trimmer and a vacuum cleaner. And I begged my parents for a Flowbee. They said, no, you'll use it on the dog. And they were right. But I mention this because sometimes what kids create will be goofy. It'll be weird. It'll be just like a Flowbee. And that's okay. They're solving problems. That's what we want them to do. Now, for us, my favorite example was the graffiti problem that we solved. And what I love about the graffiti problem is that someone realized, I asked for the biggest issues that we were facing, and they did needs assessments, they gathered data. But the winning group, each group had to create a proposal for solving the graffiti problem at our school. And I love that the winning group said, instead of painting over the graffiti and monitoring it to try to prevent it from happening, what if we actually found out why people do graffiti? And they did a heat map of all the hot spots of graffiti, and they found out that there were two places where there was no graffiti in our neighborhood. One was this Catholic church across the street. Another one was the library and community center. Those were not tagged up at all. And so they said, these are sacred spaces. Now, the back of the Walmart was completely tagged up. And I remember they pitched it to a Shark Tank style group where there was a community activist, a small business owner, and the principal. They did their presentation. And I still remember they said, what if school looked less like a Walmart and more like a sacred space? We want to paint murals. And so they did. That was the winning group. And it started a new project where we actually painted 8 murals over 3 years. And again, it's because they were empowered to solve problems. The sixth idea is to empower students to own the collaborative process. It's the idea of teaching them conflict resolution so they resolve conflicts on their own, having them come up with their own team agreements. doing activities where they work interdependently. It might involve some accountability, like group contracts. It also involve teaching them how to manage the project management process, having them use things like Trello to monitor their progress, or giving them a project management log that they can use. Maybe having them keep their own spreadsheet as a small group to show their progress in terms of project management. So that's the idea of empowering them to own that collaborative process. The final idea is to empower students to own the creative process. I love this quote from Chris Lehman, who says, if you assign a project and get back 30 of the exact same thing, that's not a project, that's a recipe. So the goal here is to empower them with things like design thinking. It could be things like having them do blogs and podcasts and documentaries. Anytime they get a chance to be creative, they are empowered to become creative thinkers. And what you're saying is, I'm not afraid to be known. Too often, student work ends up only on the refrigerator, but when they get a chance to launch their work, they grow as people. They work harder. They become fearless. They develop that growth mindset. They connect the learning to their world. They find their creative voice. They engage in iterative thinking. They become more empathetic. They embrace constructive criticism, and they become fearless. In the end, the big question is, where do we start? And it's up to us individually. The reality is, if you think about these different areas where you empower students, I guarantee you're already doing this. And I would also say that sometimes it involves looking at that uncertainty and taking that leap to empower students. In the end, though, it really is not just about the product that kids create or even the process. It's about the people, and it's about what you do as a teacher to empower your students. Truly, what matters most is that relationship that happens when students feel known and empowered, and they grow as a result. And you become that teacher that they remember forever because you've empowered them with voice and choice. So I just want to end by saying thank you for the amazing work that you're already doing. Thank you for empowering your students with voice and choice. Thank you.